On February 11, 1960, Jack Paar did something no TV host had ever done before. He looked into the camera during his live show and quit in front of millions on television. The show ran for 3 hours straight, from 7 in the morning until 9 in the morning. At the time, there wasn't even a full network, so we had to repeat it for the West Coast from 9 to 10. Jack Paar was born on May 1, 1918, in Canton, Ohio. When he returned a month later, his first words shocked America even more. The man who invented late-night TV was never the same again. On the surface, it looked like he was furious because NBC cut a toilet joke without telling him. However, there was more to the story. Something darker had been simmering behind the scenes for weeks. Tragically, Jack's older brother passed away in a car crash when he was 5 years old. The loss rocked his family to its foundation and altered Jack's perspective on life. As his parents battled to overcome the tragedy, young Jack absorbed the sorrow around him, which did more than make him reserved or wary. It made him feel everything profoundly. The reasons behind his strong on-screen connection stem from unresolved childhood wounds. He also endured a severe stutter, which made even the most mundane conversations feel like fights. To overcome this, he experimented with unconventional methods, such as putting buttons in his mouth to train his tongue, and even yelled at his teachers to help him speak more clearly. Jack became one of the most famous voices in television history after becoming severely ill with tuberculosis at the age of 14. He spent nights in bed, attempting to speak clearly. These were not merely strange habits, but acts of pure desperation, because his stutter didn't go away easily. That was terrifying, but instead of giving in, he turned to his imagination. He began hosting imaginary radio shows in his head, complete with guests, jokes, and music. The illness didn't break him, but it gave him a dream. He realized he wanted to be a radio host and entertain, and his sick bed became his sanctuary. Upon his recovery, he continued to pursue his dream. At the age of 16, he decided to forego the safety net that education offered during the Great Depression and dropped out of Jackson High School. Despite his lack of a diploma, training, and connections, he was driven by his voice and his dream. He was certain that he wouldn't succeed academically, but he thought that life's true lessons could be found on the streets. His first job in radio was at WIBBM in Jackson, Michigan. It wasn't glamorous. He read a simple line on air and then had to do janitorial work like sweeping floors and taking out the trash, but it set the tone for everything that followed. He was willing to gamble on his instincts. He didn't grumble, but instead studied the equipment, mimicked the announcers, and worked his way up the ladder. The experience grounded him. He'd never forget the broom in his hand or the dirt on his shoes, and it had made him patient, humble, and hungry for more. In 1942, at the age of 25, Jack was drafted into the U.S. Army and assigned, serving as an entertainer for the soldiers of the 28th Special Service Company, where he initially stood out due to his clean fingernails and polished voice. However, things changed when he was deployed to the South Pacific. There, he endured brutal days, little food, and constant fear. However, Jack had one quality that others didn't share. A joke he cracked during a submarine alert, in which he implied that the Japanese sub was attempting to. It was during basic training that he became the soldiers' favorite act, bringing them food and breaking the tension through laughter and tears. He met Miriam Wagner at a dinner dance. She was from Hershey, Pennsylvania, and her family had ties to the chocolate company. Jack decided to marry her the moment he saw her. The following day, they got engaged, which sounded crazy, but it was true. Jack found his edge while performing for the troops, making fun of the officers and the military rules. His marriage lasted over 60 years until his death in 2004, and she became his anchor through his fame and breakdowns. Their love story wasn't a show, it was real. While on another show he said, "Some try, a few are sincere, and what the hell a couple even know what they're doing." He wasn't scared to say what the soldiers couldn't or wouldn't, and officers didn't always approve, but they did. He once told a lieutenant, "A man with your IQ should have a low voice too." In 1944, a war correspondent named Sidney Carroll saw one of Jack's performances and wrote about it in Esquire. Carroll praised Jack's fearless comedy, and when the article made its way back home, it changed everything. Jack Parr was suddenly a phenomenon among the troops, thanks to his sharp, bold, and unforgettable performances. RKO was one of the top 5 Hollywood studios at the time, and Jack Parr signed with it after World War II. However, despite his charisma and comedic abilities, the studio's leadership was confused about how to use him, and they even tried giving him screen time. Howard Hughes was the studio's eccentric and unpredictable boss, testing in small roles in the hopes that something would click, but nothing did. They couldn't agree on whether he should play the lead or a comedic supporting role, and the whole thing felt stuck. One executive warmly referred to him as Kaiser, which made him sound like the popular band leader who played silly radio shows, but Parr was friendlier. Another executive said he looked like. The fact that Parr was compared to both Alan Ladd and Shane, 2 very different actors, made it clear that no one had a clue what kind of actor he was, and that uncertainty followed him onto every set he was a part of, whether it was for side roles, odd jobs, or even just hosting variety acts. The studio was unable to mold him into a star because they were unsure of his desired type of star. In 1951, Parr landed a small role in a black-and-white, low-budget film called Love Nest. The film was set in post-war New York and had one peculiar detail. Marilyn Monroe, who was not famous at the time, played his girlfriend. It's strange to see Parr and Monroe on screen together now, 2 stars who would go on to become household names, sharing scenes before either of them became famous. The film bombed, but it's now considered a piece of Hollywood trivia. Parr was one of the few actresses to appear in a film starring Marilyn Monroe. Real role for the majority of his filmography wasn't centered around acting in the traditional sense. Instead, he served as a producer and host for variety shows like Variety Time, 1948, and Footlight Varieties, 1951. These films weren't your average feature films. Instead, they were compilations of various musical acts, comedic skits, and dance numbers. His smooth delivery gave the show a rhythm despite being just a collection of short clips. These abilities later helped him become one of the biggest names in late-night TV when Jack Parr took over the show. He wasn't a movie star, but he stood out in his own way. One of his films even featured performers like Red Buttons and Liberace. In July 1957, The Tonight Show was on the verge of cancellation after NBC's disastrous attempt to transform it into a late-night news magazine, Tonight America After Dark, caused viewers to stop tuning in and the network to stop airing the show. Then along came Parr, who was hosting a morning show on CBS. Nobody was expecting much, but after just 1 week, Parr turned things around. He instructed the producers, "Don't make it an interview, make it a conversation." And so, night after night, he sat down with guests and had meaningful conversations with them, including not only actors and singers, but also politicians, thinkers, and newcomers like Fidel Castro, Billy Graham, and Judy Garland. In 1958, NBC rechristened the show The Jack Parr Show, an unprecedented move that demonstrated how quickly he had become a star and attracted advertisers. Garland, who asked genuine questions, listened attentively, and opened up, not only attracted viewers, but also local NBC stations. By the end of his first year on the air, the show had become one of the most watched programs on television. From denture cream to shampoo, every sponsor wanted a piece of the action, and it all happened from a small set with no big stage or flashy production values. But he was making $10 to $15 million annually from ads worth more than $150 million. Today, he was drawing in 7 million viewers nightly, and the number of NBC stations airing the show jumped from 60 to 158. There were no dancing girls, just a desk, a sofa, and a piano played by his old army friend Jose Mice. However, the conversation was anything but quiet. Parr would cry, get angry, laugh so hard he had to stop talking, and guests would open up stories that went deep. Viewers felt like they were eavesdropping on something private, which is why it became the blueprint for every. After his talk show days, Parr expanded his role as a talent scout. He discovered Carol Burnett, Woody Allen, Bill Cosby, and Liza Minnelli, all of whom made early appearances on Parr's show. Parr also revived underappreciated regulars like Charlie Weaver and Alexander King, transforming them into household names. He was passionate about taking chances. Many successful careers started on his couch, but what set Parr apart was his raw emotion. He wept on camera, discussed his daughter's first bra, and opened up about his own struggles with self-doubt, anxiety, and frustration. This unnerved viewers, but they couldn't tear themselves away from the show. This was all before 1960. On February 10th, everything came crashing down. Parr had recorded a 4-minute joke about the term water closet, which is the British word for toilet. It was humorous, lighthearted, and full of word play. The story revolved around a Swiss schoolmaster who mistakenly believed that WC stood for Wayside Chapel. He proceeded to write a lengthy letter detailing how the chapel was 9 miles away, only open on Sundays, and frequently overwhelmed with visitors, forcing them to share seats. However, NBC censors had already cut the joke without informing Parr. He was informed only after the show had already aired, which made him furious, not because the joke had been cut, but because he felt humiliated, because he had invested so much in the show and they had edited his work without his knowledge. This kind of betrayal didn't sit well with him. The following night, on February 11th, Parr returned to the show. Instead of hosting the show, he delivered an 8-minute speech in which he told the nation, "There must be a better way of making a living than this," while also expressing his anger, sadness, and exhaustion. He then walked off the set, hugging DS, leaving the announcer stunned and alone to finish the show. Viewers couldn't believe what they were seeing. He retreated to Florida during his absence, but rumors persisted that he was planning to return to the late-night powerhouse he had built. The story ran on the front page of newspapers, leading many to believe that his departure was a publicity stunt. However, it turned out to be more serious than that. Parr remained off the air for nearly a month. In the weeks that followed, NBC frantically worked behind the scenes to get him back. There must be a better way to make a living, he thought to himself as he stepped back onto the stage on March 7th, to an applauding audience. He stared directly into the camera and said, "As I was saying before I was interrupted, laughter broke out across the country." He continued, "When I walked off I said, there must be. Well, I've checked, and there isn't." The audience adored him, and he made them feel like they knew him. He wasn't afraid to admit that his exit was emotional and innocent, which only served to heighten the impact of the moment. Millions of people tuned in that night, and his return was one of the most watched broadcasts of the year. Parr's exit had gone national. The news spread like wildfire as soon as it happened, appearing on front pages of newspapers across the country. NBC panicked, trying reruns and guest hosts, but nothing worked. Viewers kept tuning out because Parr wasn't just another TV host. He brought something wild and human. Behind the scenes, executives met privately with him, even during accidental run-ins. Florida officials were reluctant to acknowledge their reliance on Parr, but they did so anyway. The conflict between artistic autonomy and corporate dominance was palpable, and rather than facing consequences, Parr was embraced upon his return. His enemies in the press were numerous, including Walter Winchell, a gossip columnist, and Dorothy Kilgallen, who became his favorite. Parr dedicated entire segments to criticizing Winchell, describing him as an idiot who couldn't confess under oath that he writes his own columns. He also made fun of Kilgallen's stiff delivery, claiming that she must use Novocaine lipstick because her lips never move when she talks. This was particularly true during his final show on March 29, 1962. That night, he went on a scathing attack, naming names and using his trademark sarcasm. His feud with Winchell was particularly ugly. Parr had teased Winchell about his self-proclaimed patriotism by suggesting that he wore the American flag like a bathrobe. In response, Winchell called Parr a mean, sick, and malicious little man. NBC occasionally had to censor Parr's most. The feud between Parr and actor Jim Botches, who was most known for his roles as the voice of Mr. Magoo and the Rich Man on Gilligan's Island, began in December 1959 and escalated into public battles between television and the press, characterized by harsh comments and a lack of mercy. Island. Nobody could fathom why Parr began insulting him, but the barbs kept flying. Botches retaliated in interviews and press releases, while Parr shifted blame and added fuel to the fire. The timing was intriguing, as Parr had been griping about comedians who railed against TV censorship, but he would soon flee for the same reason. The Botches feud demonstrated how quickly. An interview Parr conducted with Fidel Castro for The Tonight Show in February 1959, shortly after Castro assumed power in Cuba, was filmed at the Havana Hilton and went viral. The interview, which was conducted in English, cast Castro in a more favorable light, and Parr probed him about caring for his son and the impact of television on children. During that era, many Americans viewed Castro as a revolutionary hero. However, as Castro's rule became more autocratic, that perception would erode. In a later joke, Parr made the half-joking, half-regrettable remark that Castro instantly became anti-American after their conversation. The episode quickly became one of. In September 1961, just 1 month after the Berlin Wall came down, Parr traveled to West Berlin to film near the Brandenburg Gate with American soldiers standing in the background. The U.S. Defense Department noticed, with some officials thinking the show looked too aggressive. Critics accused Parr of playing with Cold War tensions, and he pushed on with the controversial broadcast. There were other shocking events as well. On January 3, 1964, a full month before Ed Sullivan did, Parr introduced the Beatles to American television. He aired a clip of them singing, "She Loves You." Most Americans had never heard of them before, but the backlash demonstrated how seriously people took his influence. He had gone from entertaining to shaping their worldview. Never heard of them before, but Parr wasn't interested in making history. He despised their music and scoffed at their supporters, saying, "I understand science is working on a cure for this." It's good to hear that England has finally caught up to our cultural level. The speaker continued, "I brought them here as a joke." He confessed years later. Parr never pretended otherwise, even when he was wrong. He also had firm boundaries that he wouldn't cross. America's first famous transgender woman, Christine Jorgensen, made national headlines, but Parr refused to have her on the show because she was too controversial. Even shows built on controversy have limits decades later. People still talk about that missed opportunity. As the years passed, Parr fell behind the times with his jokes about gay people. He had welcomed politicians, revolutionaries, and religious leaders, but when it came to Jorgensen, he said no. It wasn't just his personal choice. Although he had a legendary guest list and brought on future stars, his style, which had been daring and innovative, now seemed out of touch, and viewers who had cheered for him were switching channels. His downfall came gradually, one poor joke at a time, as societal values were rapidly changing and Parr failed to adapt. Presidents Kennedy and Nixon, as well as Senator Robert F. Kennedy and evangelist Billy Graham were among the guests he interviewed. Unlike other talk shows, Parr took the time to ask thoughtful questions and get thoughtful answers. As a result, late night became more meaningful, and listeners paid attention rather than simply laughing. Jack Parr first crossed paths with pianist Irene Gubbins at a Cleveland radio station in the late 1930s. The couple married on Valentine's Day, 1938, in Mahoning, Ohio. However, their relationship didn't last long. They divorced 2 years later. Then, in a surprising turn of events, they remarried on August 10, 1940, in Cuyahoga. Unfortunately, their marriage didn't endure, and they divorced twice later. When asked about her, Parr hardly recalled anything. He simply said, "Her name sounded familiar." He seemed to have erased all memories of her from his life. This wasn't the only peculiar thing about Jack Parr, though. He once described himself using a lengthy list of words, including complicated, sentimental, truthful, kind, and lonely, but then he said something that stuck. "My personality is not split, it's shredded." Because he wasn't acting, he showed the audience every side of himself, even the sloppy ones. He was the type of person who sobbed on national television 1 minute and slammed critics the next. Messiness also seeped into his live television stories. On one occasion, he opened up about his daughter getting her first bra. On another occasion, he described standing nude and shivering in a bathtub, an experience that millions of viewers were witnessing. Unlike other hosts, Jack didn't hold back. His show felt personal, uncomfortable at times, but honest, and that's why viewers tuned in. They were married in Campbelltown, Pennsylvania, on October 9, 1943, after becoming engaged at a dance while stationed at Indiantown Gap during World War II. Their marriage lasted for over 60 years, and Miriam brought stability to Jack's life. They had a daughter, Randy. In spite of his predictable behavior at home, Jack was born in 1949 and had a single, long-term relationship with his wife, to which he credited for much of his success. On the job, he quit The Tonight Show on March 29, 1962. The show was at the top of its game, bringing in $15 million in advertising annually, but Jack had had enough. His previous run ended that night, and he began Johnny Carson's Jack Paar program in September 1962, which aired on Fridays and featured interviews with celebrities. Years later, he stormed off the air after NBC cut a joke about a toilet. He returned after 3 weeks, but in 1962, he left again for good. He later said that quitting was the worst decision he had ever made. Similar to Judy Garland and Richard Burton, he even introduced the Beatles to American audiences weeks before their Ed Sullivan debut. However, the show's weekly format failed to capture the magic of his nightly presence, and by 1965, it had been canceled. Then, shockingly, at the age of 47, Jack decided to walk away from television altogether, and instead paid $1,250,000 to purchase a TV and FM radio station in Poland Spring, Maine. For rural property, that was a lot of money back then, but Jack wanted peace, so he ran the station himself and sold it for a tidy profit. He had also invested early in Polaroid stock, which made him even richer. Like most celebrities, Jack left the show in 1973, but ABC wanted him back so bad that he agreed to host 1 week per month against Carson, but it was. Jack quietly ended his comeback, because viewers no longer connected with him, and because he knew that times had changed. What shocked everyone was that he began tossing out the original color videotapes of his show, one by one, in the trash. What remains today are grainy, incomplete black and white copies. Tragically, Jack's health began to deteriorate after undergoing triple bypass surgery in 1998, and he suffered a stroke in 2003. A year later, on January 27, 2004, at the age of 85, he passed away in Greenwich, Connecticut, with his wife Miriam and daughter by his side. His monologues and interviews, which had shaped early TV history, were erased as well. Randy were present during his cremation, and his family received his ashes. Obituaries of him appeared in all the major newspapers. Johnny Carson, who succeeded him, praised him as a one-of-a-kind character who added something fresh to late-night television.